Today, on It Takes a Killer, a disaffected man snaps and goes on a rampage, terrorizing the entire borough of Brooklyn, New York. This deranged criminal leaves a trail of dead bodies in his wake before cops finally hunt him down across the city. Brooklyn, New York, Friday, February 11th, 2011, 5:11 a.m. 48-year-old Svetlana Gelman calls 911 in a panic.
The dispatcher is having a hard time understanding what's going on, but can tell that there's some kind of domestic situation between Svetlana and two unknown men.
At one point during the call, Svetlana screams out, "He's going to kill you." One of the men is repeatedly asking for a set of keys, while the other asks, "What did you do?"
Just before the call ends, Svetlana yells, "He's going to kill me."
Paramedics and officers from the NYPD's 61st Precinct are dispatched to the residence, which is in Sheepshead Bay, an enclave of Russian immigrants in the south end of Brooklyn.
Svetlana meets the first responders at the front door. They step past her immediately and see the body of her 54-year-old common-law husband, Alexander Kuznetsov, face down on a rug between the kitchen and a bedroom.
EMTs roll Kuznetsov over and attempt to render aid.
He's covered in blood from a multitude of stab wounds, and there's a bloody steak knife on the ground next to him.
When Alexander was pronounced dead at 5:21 a.m., Svetlana blurts out, "My son murdered my husband."
Detectives speak with Svetlana, hoping to make sense of the crime scene.
Svetlana explains that shortly after 5 o'clock that morning, her 23-year-old son Maksim came into the bedroom she shares with Alexander, demanding the keys to her Lexus. She told him no.
At that point, Alexander stepped in and started cursing Maksim in Russian. The confrontation turned physical.
At one point, Maksim grabbed a long knife from the kitchen, which prompted his stepfather to yell for Svetlana to call the police.
As Svetlana was on the phone with 911, Maksim started violently stabbing Kuznetsov.
It's later determined that Maksim stabbed his stepfather a total of 55 times to the forehead, left temple, neck, chest, and armpit.
By 10 that morning, the NYPD has a citywide manhunt in effect for Maksim Gelman.
Police distribute a mugshot from Maksim's recent drug arrest to local media and internet sites. They also issue a be on the lookout or BOLO alert for his mother's 2004 Lexus, which he fled the scene driving. The cops have no idea where he's headed.
Sheepshead Bay, New York, Friday, February 11th, 2011, 4 p.m. 20-year-old receptionist Yelena Bulchenko is walking home down East 24th Street when she receives a disturbing call from her friend Renata.
Yelena learns that there's a wanted poster circulating around Brooklyn for Maksim Gelman. Maksim and Yelena had been friends the previous summer, but she became increasingly afraid of him.
Maksim would often show up at Yelena's house and beg her to let him in. He called and texted so frequently that she was forced to change her number and cut him off.
Apparently, Maksim did not take too kindly to being rejected by Yelena.
Yelena's still on the phone when she arrives home. As she puts her key into the lock, she tells Renata not to worry about Maksim and that she'll call her back later, then hangs up.
As soon as Yelena enters the residence, she's greeted by a horrific sight. Her mother, Anna, lying in the hallway, having been viciously stabbed in the neck and chest.
Yelena freaks out and calls 911. Then, she runs outside to wait for help to arrive. Moments later, a gray Lexus pulls into the driveway.
Maksim Gelman gets out of the car, pulling a knife out of his jacket sleeve, and heads straight for Yelena.
Yelena runs over to a neighbor who's nearby outside his home. The neighbor steps in to physically block her from Maksim, who continues to approach.
Maksim starts attacking the neighbor with the knife until he overpowers him and pushes him out of the way. The neighbor runs off to get help as Maksim grabs Yelena, throws her to the ground, and starts stabbing her violently.
Once Yelena stops resisting, Maksim gets up, walks back over to the car, and gets in. As he prepares to drive away, he realizes that Yelena might not actually be dead.
Maksim gets back out of the car, grabs her by the hair, and continues to stab her, even slashing her across the throat.
Just then, a fire truck is coming down the street en route to another call.
Yelena's neighbor runs out into the street and flags down the firefighters, yelling, "Help her," and pointing at Yelena on the sidewalk.
Yelena is obscured by the parked cars, but the firefighters do see Maksim moving his arm downward in a rapid fashion. They jump out of the fire truck and rush over to render assistance.
As the firefighters approach, Maksim leaves Yelena on the sidewalk and quick walks back to the Lexus. He gets in, peels out of the driveway, and speeds off.
The firefighters finally reach Yelena where she's lying underneath a tree, bleeding heavily from her neck. They attempt to stop the bleeding until EMS arrives to rush her off to nearby Coney Island Hospital.
NYPD detectives Stephen Cavendish and Patrick Henn arrive at the scene within minutes. They enter the residence Yelena shares with her mother.
Inside, near the kitchen, Cavendish and Henn find the dead body of Yelena's mother, Anna Bulchenko. Anna appears to have suffered 12 stab wounds to her neck, her torso, and extremities. There are additional injuries which indicate she'd also been stabbed multiple times with a fork.
The large amount of pooled blood around Anna's body indicates that the stabbing took place hours ago. Blood found in the hallway where Anna lays dead, coupled with knives found on the floor and the table inside the kitchen, seem to indicate that a struggle took place between Anna and her attacker, and that she'd attempted to flee.
Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, NYPD officers have responded to the intersection of East 24th and Avenue U, the site of a suspected carjacking.
The stabbing victim wasn't immediately located, but the gray 2004 Lexus belonging to Svetlana Gelman, which had been stolen by her son, remains double parked on the street with no key in the ignition. Maksim Gelman is nowhere to be found.
The cabin is a mess. There's dried blood inside as well as 4 knives. The car is towed back to the police yard for inspection.
Before long, an Officer McGovern searches the area and spots a man up against the wall of a building with multiple bystanders rendering assistance.
The man is 50-year-old Arthur DiCrescento. He has been stabbed and is in rough condition. DiCrescento manages to tell the officers that he was stopped at the light at the intersection when the Lexus behind him rammed his 1995 Pontiac.
Suddenly, a young white male ran up on him and tapped on the window. Arthur says he rolled down the window and the man yelled, "Get out of the car." When he didn't immediately comply, the man reached through the window and stabbed him in the chest and face.
Arthur then got out of the car, and his attacker got in and sped off northbound on 24th Street.
The attack has Maksim Gelman's signature all over it. Now detectives need to find him bad.
Coming up, the manhunt for Maksim Gelman intensifies. But can cops locate him before he strikes again? You're watching It Takes a Killer.
Gelman is also suspected of stabbing 50-year-old Arthur DiCrescento, who'd been carjacked minutes after the attack on Yelena Bulchenko, 3 blocks away on East 24th and Avenue U.
Despite the close proximity of all the carnage, authorities have no clue where Maksim Gelman is.
Brooklyn, New York, Friday, February 11th, 2011, 4:30 p.m. Dispatchers receive a flood of 911 calls about a pedestrian being struck by a motorist at the southeast corner of Ocean Avenue and Avenue R.
The incident is just 7 blocks away from where Arthur DiCrescento had been carjacked just minutes earlier.
Police quickly arrive on the scene. They learn the victim is 62-year-old rare coin collector Stephen Tannenbaum.
While EMS treats Tannenbaum at the scene, officers begin asking bystanders for their accounts.
Multiple eyewitnesses describe how Tannenbaum had been walking in the south crosswalk when a vehicle barreled through the red light at a high rate of speed, around 45 miles an hour. The car hit Tannenbaum without ever stopping and sped off northbound on Ocean Avenue.
Apparently, the driver struck Tannenbaum so hard his body came to rest 88 feet away in the southbound lane of Ocean Avenue.
It's clear from eyewitness descriptions that the vehicle that hit Tannenbaum was Arthur DiCrescento's stolen Pontiac. Due to the proximity and circumstances, police are certain Maksim Gelman is behind the hit and run.
Tannenbaum is transported to nearby Kings County Hospital.
Trauma surgeons work hard to save his life, but he succumbs to his injuries later that evening.
6 miles away at Coney Island Hospital, Yelena Bulchenko also succumbs to her injuries from the multiple stab wounds inflicted upon her by Maksim Gelman.
At 9:40 that night, police receive an urgent call from a homeowner who explains that a car has been abandoned in her driveway and it's still running.
Within minutes, an NYPD detective arrives at the residence, which is on East 15th Street in Brooklyn. The officer quickly determines that the car in the driveway is Arthur DiCrescento's stolen Pontiac.
There's a circular fracture on the windshield and additional damage to the body, which seems to confirm suspicions that the vehicle had been involved in a collision with a pedestrian.
Police continue their search for Maksim Gelman late into the evening, believing he's hiding out somewhere in the vicinity. Knowing Gelman's a low-level drug dealer and avid graffiti artist, cops search areas along underpasses and train tracks where Gelman and other graffiti artists are known to hang.
Officers find multiple pieces of graffiti that say Yelena, including one with a heart tag next to it. Yet Maksim Gelman continues to elude law enforcement.
Crown Heights, Brooklyn, Saturday, February 12th, 2011, 12:50 a.m. 55-year-old driver Fitz Fullerton is transporting a female passenger in his Lincoln Town Car near the corner of St. John's Place and Rochester Avenue when Maksim Gelman comes out of the darkness and jumps into the car.
The female passenger jumps out as Maksim commands Fullerton to turn right on St. Mark's Avenue and says, "Drive, drive, drive."
Fullerton asks his frenzied passenger where he's going. At that moment, Gelman places a kitchen knife against Fullerton's throat and exclaims, "I'm going to murder you now."
Maxim then slices both of the driver's cheeks down to the jaw and stabs him in the neck and shoulder.
A violent struggle ensues. Eventually, Fullerton releases his foot from the brake, causing the town car, which is still in gear, to ram into a parked SUV.
Gelman jumps out of the vehicle and flees the scene on foot.
Fullerton subsequently calls 911. He's eventually transported to Brookdale Hospital for treatment of his injuries.
Just 5 minutes later, at 12:55 a.m., 25-year-old Jamaican immigrant Sheldon Pottinger is sitting inside his parked Nissan Maxima on Eastern Parkway, waiting for his wife to leave a church function.
Maxim Gelman runs up on the vehicle, yanks open the driver's side door and yells, "Get out of the car, I'm going to kill you." Then he begins stabbing at Pottinger's hands on the steering wheel.
Pottinger's wife, Chantel, watches from the sidewalk in horror as Gelman pushes her husband over to the passenger seat and then drives off.
2 blocks down the road, Pottinger leaps from the moving vehicle. Despite multiple injuries, he manages to stumble back up the street before collapsing at his wife's feet. Chantel calls 911.
Pottinger is rushed to a local hospital where his wounds are treated and he's eventually released. 2.5 hours later, at 3:15 a.m., he sits down with detectives at the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office.
Pottinger gives officers the description of his attacker, which precisely matches Maxim Gelman.
By the following morning, Saturday, February 12th, law enforcement has been tracking Gelman's carnage for little more than 24 hours and still has no leads to where the unhinged man is or what his next move might be.
Around 8 a.m., reports start coming in to the NYPD that Maxim is walking through the subway tunnels and along third rail coverings in Queens, New York.
Police begin scouring the 1, 2, and 3 subway lines.
Around 8:30 Saturday morning, a woman is riding the southbound number 1 train between 137th and 96th Streets in Harlem.
The woman is reading a newspaper with Maxim Gelman's picture on it. Suddenly, she recognizes that the man standing next to her is in fact Gelman.
Panic-stricken, the woman gets off at the next stop, 96th Street, and runs to tell the authorities what happened. Transit police move quickly to set up a checkpoint at 34th Street, Penn Station.
Transit officers Terrence Howell and Tamara Taylor are en route to the platform when the southbound number 1 train pulls into Penn Station.
Gelman gets off the train and crosses the tracks. Howell and Taylor follow him as he heads towards the incoming northbound number 3 train. The officers board the train and head straight for the motorman's area.
The number 3 train departs the station, headed for Times Square.
Minutes later, the train comes to an abrupt stop in the tunnel. Maxim has stabbed fellow passenger, 40-year-old Joseph Lozito, believing that Lozito was looking at him suspiciously.
Apparently, Maxim pulled a long knife from his sleeve, told Lozito, "You're gonna die," and then stabbed him in the face. Maxim stabbed Lozito 3 additional times to the back of his head before he was subdued and handcuffed by Officer Howell and an off-duty cop, Marcelo Razzo, who just happened to be riding the train.
The 2 men restrain Gelman for the next 25 minutes until power is restored and the train returns to the station.
Back at the platform, Gelman is taken into transit authority custody.
Police search Gelman for weapons or other contraband, and inside his jacket pocket they find the bloody knife Gelman used on Lozito, as well as 3 straight razor blades and a paring knife and $932 in cash.
As officers bring Gelman out onto the street, he exclaims, "You should stay away from angel dust," and "I did this because I have cancer."
Gelman is then placed into an NYPD squad car and taken away.
In the meantime, Joseph Lozito is transported to Bellevue Hospital and stabilized, having suffered 7 stab wounds.
Manhattan, New York, Saturday, February 12, 2011, 9:45 a.m. Maxim Gelman arrives at Midtown South Precinct. He's placed in a second-floor interview room, still handcuffed. Detectives Patrick Henn, Stephen Cavendish, and James Normile enter the room.
He agrees to speak with detectives without an attorney present, but he doesn't offer anything valuable. Instead, between fits of bizarre and maniacal laughter, he says things like, "Yesterday was a doozy, and I like to party. Do you like to party?"
At one point, Gelman claims they had to die and she was a bitch. When he's asked why people had to die, Gelman responds, "Because I said so."
Detectives terminate the interview. Gelman is transferred back to Brooklyn to face charges there.
At the 61st Precinct, just before 9 o'clock Saturday night, Maksim Gelman is paraded in front of witnesses in a series of lineups.
One by one, witnesses from the Bolchenko's house, as well as the DeCrescento, Fullerton, and Pottinger carjacking sites, confirm that suspect number 3, Maksim Gelman, is the person responsible.
The following day, Sunday the 13th, Maksim is transferred to Rikers Island. On the way, he callously tells an officer, "I'll beat this. I'll go to a mental hospital for a few years and then I'll get out on the street again. You'll see."
A week later, Maksim Gelman is indicted in Kings County Criminal Court on 13 counts ranging from second-degree murder to second-degree robbery for his actions against Alexander Kuznetsov, Anna and Yelena Bolchenko, Stephen Tannenbaum, Arthur DeCrescento, Fitz Fullerton, and Sheldon Pottinger.
Gelman is soon indicted in Manhattan on attempted murder and assault charges for his attack on Joseph Lozito on the number 3 train.
Coming up, the evolution of Maksim Gelman, from wayward child to volatile criminal. On February 12, 2011, the NYPD apprehends Maksim Gelman at 34th Street Station in Manhattan, New York. Gelman suspected of committing 4 murders and an additional 4 maimings during a 28-hour crime spree. Law enforcement will spend the next 11 months trying to figure out exactly who Mad Max is and what could have possibly turned him into a cold-blooded killer.
Maksim Gelman was born in Ukraine in May 1987. His father immigrated to the U.S. as a refugee 5 years later. 7-year-old Maksim and his mother Svetlana followed in 1994.
When Maksim's father returns to the Ukraine, he and his mother stay behind in America, eventually gaining citizenship in 2005.
As a teenager, Maksim shows an interest in skateboarding, photography, and art, which manifests into his becoming a graffiti artist.
Before long, Maksim begins using PCP and other drugs. He also occasionally deals drugs.
Beginning in 2003, 16-year-old Max starts building a criminal record, which grows to include almost a dozen arrests for vandalism, robbery, and drug possession.
With his biological father back in Ukraine and his dislike for his mother's common-law husband, Alexander Kuznetsov, Maksim was apparently uneasy about his place in life.
The older Max gets, the more aggressive he becomes. He tries to bulk up and participates in street fights.
Around the summer of 2010, Maksim meets Yelena Bolchenko. They're friendly, but never date.
Common associates of the two say Maksim eventually becomes obsessed with Yelena. When she stops answering his calls, he starts showing up at her door unannounced.
On one occasion, a neighbor hears Gelman yell that he'll kill Yelena if she doesn't open the door for him.
Maksim denies ever stalking Yelena, claiming instead that she wasn't even his type and had crossed him.
In early 2011, Maksim becomes increasingly paranoid, most likely because of his constant abuse of angel dust. He's arrested on January 26th for crack possession.
On the night of February 10th, Maksim purchases a kilo of cocaine to deal. Yet on the drive home, he believes federal agents are following him. He claims that his phone starts calling people by itself and the battery drains really fast.
Paranoid, Maksim rips up the kilo and dumps it in a nearby waterway, then books a ticket to the Dominican Republic so he can lay low.
At 5 a.m. on the morning of February 11th, Maksim returns home to get his passport and say goodbye to his mother.
That's when he gets into a rage-filled argument with Alexander Kuznetsov. He kills his stepfather, steals his mother's car, then takes off to correct a number of wrongs he feels others have done to him.
His first stop is Yelena Bolchenko's home, but she isn't there. Maksim gets her mother Anna to open the door and repeatedly asks her where Yelena is, but she won't divulge that information.
Maksim pulls a small knife and stabs Anna multiple times. She pretends to give up, but then makes a break for the front door.
Maksim kicks the door closed. Eventually, he grabs a knife from a knife block in the kitchen and stabs her to death. He kills Yelena 6 hours later outside the same home.
Fast forward to the spring of 2011. Maksim undergoes psychiatric evaluation to determine his mental fitness to stand trial.
Dr. Alexander Bardet determines that Gelman isn't so unstable that he could be considered not guilty by reason of insanity. And Gelman suddenly realizes that his plan to spend a couple of years in a mental institution before earning his freedom won't work.
On November 30th, 2011, Maksim Gelman pleads guilty to murder and various other charges. As part of the deal, he waives his right to appeal.
2 months later, Gelman formally pleads guilty to second-degree attempted murder in a Manhattan court for the stabbing of Joseph Lozito. He receives the maximum allowable sentence of 25 years.
Brooklyn, New York. Wednesday, January 18th, 2012. Maxim appears in Kings County State Supreme Court to be sentenced for the crimes he committed in his home borough.
Gelman receives a sentence of 200 years to life in prison, 25 years for each of the murders of Alexander Kuznetsov, Anna Bulchenko, Yelena Bulchenko, and Stephen Tannenbaum, the man he killed during a hit and run.
Gelman gets 100 additional years for 9 other charges. From a young age, Maxim Gelman seemed to be a ticking time bomb, and he eventually became an uncontrolled monster that unleashed carnage over a 28-hour period.
Maxim Gelman was more sociopathic, more psychotic than most of the crazies out there. He had more than just sociopathy, he had bloodlust.